Hi creative friends, this is Rhea and thank you for being here. Today's video is part 2 to oil pastels and mixed media. If you haven't watched part 1, I'll leave a link in the description below. So I made a video on using oil pastels in mixed media and how we can layer various art supplies over top of it. And I received a lot of comments, questions, and concerns. I absolutely love the conversation and thanks to each of you for voicing your thoughts. I so appreciate it. So let's dive right in. The general rule is that oil pastels should be your absolute last layer in mixed media. And this is true if you want your work to be archival. So just say you're selling a piece of your art or you're gifting it to someone or you yourself want to preserve it, then please do not layer any media over top of your oil pastels. I'm sorry if I wasn't clear enough about that point when I made my video. I was illustrating how I use oil pastels in my art, primarily journals and sketchbooks, which I am not going to sell and I have no interest in preserving. And I was just showing you that there are so many different mixed media that we can apply over top of oil pastels, because sometimes we hear a rule and we don't think to question it. So that was my intention behind making that video. But I realize now that I wasn't clear about a few points. So hopefully this video will clear those things up. Now, I have a few special art journals that I want to pass down to my daughter, but truthfully, she may not even want them. And most of my art journals are for me. They're a safe space for me to create, to pour out my emotions and thoughts and stories. And what I'm most interested in is creating the image that I want. So let me show you how I have added all sorts of mixed media on top of oil pastels. Now, this particular journal is about 5 years old, and it is a work in progress. I tend to look at all of my art journals as constantly being works of progress because I might come back to something years later and redo everything, cover the whole page up, or do whatever I want to do with it. So I never really look at them as being completed works of art. So on this cover over here, I have used oil pastels in my first layers and my middle layers. I don't think I added any of it on my final layers. Now, let me just say that the second reason we are cautioned not to use other media on top of oil pastels is that over time, whatever media you put on top, it may crumble off because oil pastels are never truly dry. So I'm going to show you what I mean. So I have this oil pastel here and I make this mark. And they're called live. When they talk about oil pastels, like oil pastels are live because they never truly dry. Like I can come back a year later and I can work over top of it. I can like smush it in. And even if I blend it in like so, I can come back a year later and I can still work over top of it. Like it never fully hardens and dries. And even if you use a fixative over top, it doesn't 100% fix it. So that being said, my take on it is that if some of the media crumbles off and exposes the oil pastels underneath, I actually welcome it. I love it. It's an added texture that I can incorporate into my art journal because life isn't perfect. I'm not perfect. My art journal pages aren't perfect. So for me, it all fits together. Now I'm going to bring this close up, and I used oil pastels over here, and some of the acrylic, it's peeled off, not noticeably so to me. And I absolutely love that texture. Now this, like I mentioned, this journal is, well, all my art journals really, but it's in various stages of completion. And I use my oil pastels over here in my first layers and even my second layers. And then I added really thin washes of acrylic paint over top of it, and to me it looks like a stained glass window. And if some of that oil pastel transfers onto the opposite page when I close it, I am not really concerned about it. I actually love all those little mishaps because it just adds to my page. And I've also used oil pastels in my first and second layers over here, and over here. Now I've used it in my last layer on this over here because see, it's getting off on my fingers. So I've used it over here as a last layer, but this page is not by any stretch complete. And same with this page. I've used my oil pastels on the first layer and the middle layers. And see, some of the oil pastel transferred onto this page over here when I closed it. And I absolutely love that. I don't want all my pages to be like really neat and tidy and kind of like static. I welcome all those interesting little things that can happen. Same here, oil pastels are used in my first layers. And this is just a background, but these are oil pastels. And like I said, this journal is quite, you know, I don't know how old it is, but this is all oil pastel over here. And see, it's coming off on my hand. So I'm going to bring this up closer. This is a background, and this is like my first/second layer. And I have put oil pastels over here and over here, because see, it's coming off on my fingers. And you know, this particular art journal is a Strathmore, so it is archival, but I also work in a cheap line composition notebook, and that's not archival. So for me, I am not worried about preserving my journals. But if you are, then again, I'm going to reiterate, please do not layer anything over top of your oil pastels. Now, a few rules I use to guide me when I am layering on top of oil pastels is that I am going to use my cheaper brands of oil pastels for my first and second layers. I'm not going to use a Sennelier. A Sennelier is very, it has a high oil content. It's going to be very fatty. And so I'm not going to use that as my first or second layer. I can layer over top of a Sennelier, which is what I illustrate in my first video, and I have done that. Like I'll add my Sennelier as my last layer, and then I might take a Stabilo pencil and, you know, mark over top of it because I want to make a texture or I want to reveal what's underneath that oil pastel, and it can make a pattern. But generally, I use my very cheaper brands of oil pastels as my first and second layers. Now, the second thing I do is I use my acrylics when I'm putting it over top of my oil pastels. I use it in very thin washes. And sometimes I will glaze it, which simply means that I apply multiple washes and allow each layer to completely dry before applying the next layer. And maybe because I add them in such a thin application that it doesn't crumble off. The second thing I do is I am not afraid to experiment. That is an actual rule that I have. And it might sound really strange as a rule, but especially when it comes to oil pastels, I am not afraid to experiment because I have all these things in my mind that say, okay, don't do this and don't do that, and you're not supposed to do this. But, you know, I just have this rule that says, well, I'm going to try it out. And that's another thing I was trying to illustrate with my first video is don't be afraid to experiment. Nothing can go wrong. If you're using a cheap blind composition notebook, you can experiment and you can say, okay, well, if this doesn't work out, okay, I haven't lost anything. I've actually gained a wealth of knowledge. So now when you go into, say, a more, like a proper, what they might call a proper art journal that's archival, etc., and you want to preserve that art journal, then you know what not to do and what to do. So that is an actual rule of mine. I am not afraid to experiment. And a few admin notes that I just want to talk about at the end of my video here is I made a mistake in my previous video on oil pastels. I said that Holbein was a Dutch company, but it's actually made in Japan. It was very graciously pointed out by a viewer, and I'm so sorry guys, but there were so many brands of oil pastels, my brain got totally scrambled. Now, the second thing I want to point out is another viewer mentioned that Sennelier makes a fixative specifically for oil pastels. And if you want to try it out, Sennelier is a top of the line brand. Now, I generally don't use fixatives because they flatten out the colors. And again, for me, if the colors smudge on the opposite page, I actually love that. Number 3, someone also mentioned that Sennelier has a starter kit of 6 pastels for under $10. There's a red, a blue, a yellow, a green, a black, and a white. So this way you don't have to spend a fortune if you just want to try it out, and I'll put a link in the description below. And the last thing I would just add is that if you know the rules, you can also choose to break them if you want. You can experiment and test and push the boundaries and express yourself in whatever way you want in your art journals, because they are a safe, private space for you to create in whichever way that you want to. So I hope that this video has been helpful, and I'm sorry for any of the kind of confusion with my first video, and I hope I've cleared everything up. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.